Thank you for the invitation to come out. The title of my talk today is Supporting the Development of Genomics Literacy Through Genetics Education Could Reduce Racial Prejudice is kind of the headline. It's the claim I'm going to advance. But really there's this larger theme, which is that the content that we teach in human genetics matters. So how we teach matters too, but what we teach matters in this context because the content isn't always socially neutral. The way that genetics is used to rationalize or refute prejudice or prejudice ideas makes this kind of teaching and learning a bit different than other kinds of teaching and learning in science education. So before I kind of get to my argument and unpack all the studies that I'm going to use to support this claim, I want to talk about how did I come to investigate this work? How did a white guy come to investigate the relationship between genetics education and racism? So I grew up in southern New Hampshire. My mom learned English in school. She was a refugee after World War II. My grandmother was kidnapped by Nazis and enslaved for the duration of the war. My grandfather was in the opening war of World War II, and he was a POW of the Nazis. So I grew up with these stories about the profound impact that that period of history had on people's lives. And so I've always been kind of interested in notions of human difference and in the ways in which those ideas have shaped kind of social structures and also the way that people are treated and human suffering. And when I was in high school, I was in high school in the late 90s. And during that time, the evidence for the out-of-Africa hypothesis, the genetic data, was still coming in. The multi-regional hypothesis of human evolution was still on the table, by and large. And I remember walking up to my biology teacher after class one day on human evolution, and I was like, are humans still evolving? And then he proceeded to tell me about the multi-regional hypothesis and the out-of-Africa hypothesis. And it was this great conversation. I walked away thinking about race, and I was like, oh, racial groups are probably pretty different, genetically speaking. I went to Colorado College and studied biology later, and it was just around the time that Stephen Jay Gould had re-released The Mismeasure of Man in response to the Bell Curve release in 1996. And he actually gave a talk at Shope Chapel at Colorado College. Probably about 1,000 people attended. It was a very big event. And he gives this whole talk on The Mismeasure of Man, and I didn't really understand much of what he said because I was very young. It just so happens that my high school biology teacher I just talked about, he actually had a relationship with E.O. Wilson as well, because he had sent E.O. Wilson this like peculiar ant that he found in his backyard, and it started this whole relationship. So I was very aware of like E.O. Wilson's ideas about island biogeography and some of the sociobiology ideas. But I wasn't aware of the kind of vehement disagreements that Stephen Jay Gould and E.O. Wilson had with one another. So I walked up after this lecture and asked the first question of Stephen Jay Gould, and I said, you know, Dr. Gould, do you think if humans hadn't developed the ability to travel across oceans, that the major populations of humans, racial groups, would have evolved into different species? And Stephen Jay Gould proceeded to just rip me apart in front of the whole audience, right? And I realized I was entering into this broader social conversation that I really had no idea about. So I studied a lot of biology and anthropology. I ended up teaching biology to middle and high school students. Those are my students. And it was during that time that I started to teach about the history of scientific racism in racially diverse classroom settings in the Bay Area that I started to develop this idea like, how is biology education shaping social cognition? How is it shaping the way we think about gender or race, for example? And I did some master's thesis work on that at the University of San Francisco. It raised more questions than answers. And then I pursued a master's in biology at Stanford University and a PhD in science education. And then after school, I moved back to Colorado to work at BSCS Science Learning. And I can talk about our organization if people have questions. So that's how I came to this study. And the point I want to make is content matters and it's not socially neutral. And here's why. So this is from the Daily Stormer. It's a white supremacist website. There is a version of this for kids called White Pride for Kids. And on this website you can read things like this. The alt-right does not accept the pseudoscientific claims that all races are equal, and instead looks to the real science of race, which shows that they have vastly different abilities, drives, and intelligence levels. Additionally, the alt-right views the Jews as a separate race with biological drives and behavior patterns which come into direct conflict with the goals and values of the white race. These are the kinds of things that are written in white supremacist manifestos before people are killed. At mosques, at synagogues, at Walmart. This is the kind of stuff that people use to rationalize that kind of violence. There's also a history of challenging naive ideas about genetic difference in science to uncover the kind of flaws of white supremacist thinking. There's a great book written by David Depew and John P. Jackson that uncovers the history of the kind of scientific articulation of the argument against white supremacy. And ASHG has also released a statement saying that modern genomics findings can't be used in this simplified way to support notions of white purity or racial purity. So there's also a history of challenging assumptions about race through science and scholarship. And Stephen Jay Gould was certainly one of those people as well, along with Dick Lewontin. Underlying these arguments are different models of human difference. So one model of human difference, which is kind of the model that's used quite often by white supremacists, is a genetic essentialist model, where the variability between groups is very great. The variability within groups is very small. So people of the same group are all kind of genetically the same. People of different groups are very different from each other genetically. That's kind of what the population structure looks like in dog breeds. In human groups, we see that there is between-group variation, but it's relatively small in proportion to the amount of within-group variation. So people of the same group are very different from each other, genetically speaking. People from different ancestry groups are slightly more different than people of the same group. So it's not that there's no difference, there's no population structure in humans. It's just that it's not as extreme as a genetic essentialist model would suggest. And if you want to learn more about that, there's a great book called Human Races, or a great paper called Human Races Are Not Like Dog Breeds that you can find. It's open access. So the question then is like, well, how does genetics education talk about race? And if you look at pre-war textbooks, like biology and human affairs, you see things like this. Human race is a matter of biological kinship and not a place of residence. The Caucasian, Australoid, Negroid, or woolly-haired, and yellow, brown, or mongoloid are scientifically agreed upon racial classification systems. A biologist expects to find natural differences in people. He's prepared to find great differences in mechanical, artistic, and intellectual ability. He knows that there are innate differences in persons that cannot be removed. Apparently all biologists are men in the 1940s as well, which might have been the case actually in some regards. And it's hard for many persons to become reconciled with these differences and in the social and economic difficulties rising out of them. Therefore, an understanding of biology prepares for living more comprehendingly in the world of natural inequalities that we have and will have until all persons are born alike. So that is a direct communication from the biology curriculum to students of the 1940s that inequality in society is simply caused by genetics. And that is a product of the history of the time when eugenics was the unifying ideology of the social and biological sciences. So we can't take a presentist perspective on this, right? Like, texts are a product of the cultures that produce those texts. So the question then is like, well, what are the cultural artifacts? How does biology curriculum look today? And how does that reflect notions of race in our society today? And scholars like John Walensky at Stanford, Gerald Spoog, Ann Morning at NYU have done that kind of work. They've analyzed textbooks. And essentially their argument is that today, race is still present in the biology curriculum, and it comes up in places like talking about monogenic disorders like sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis. It's true, sickle cell is much more prevalent among sub-Saharan Africans than other groups. It's also found in other populations. Same thing goes with cystic fibrosis, which changes clinically with distance from Northern Europe, Tay-Sachs. So there are diseases that are more common in some groups. The question is, why are we talking about something as powerful as race in the biology curriculum, a powerful social concept, without providing kids any other context or understanding for that concept? So the biology curriculum today indirectly associates particular racial groups with specific genetic diseases. And in my first foray into research, I wanted to understand, well, does that have an impact on how kids think about race? So I ran a series of double-blinded randomized control trials where if you're in my classroom, half of you are randomly assigned to learn about human genetic diseases with racial terminology, half of you without racial terminology. So like cystic fibrosis is a disease of Caucasians. Sickle cell anemia is a disease of Africans or African Americans, which you can kind of see here. This is how many textbooks describe sickle cell anemia. Or the distribution of sickle cell anemia, the prevalence in world populations. So the question was, when we knock race out of the curriculum, we can then study the impact of leaving race in the curriculum to see how it influences beliefs about race. So we ran a series of randomized trials. These are with 7th to 9th graders. They were 3 underpowered experiments, relatively speaking. What we found is that when we compared students in the racial condition to those who learned with the non-racialized materials that didn't include any racial terminology, we found the same findings over and over again. So the kids in the racial condition were significantly more likely to endorse the idea that races differ in intelligence and academic ability because of genes. And they would say things like this: Black and Hispanic students may have genes that cause them to have a harder time learning. No students in the non-racial condition would say stuff like that after these experiments. So there's this inference that kids are making, which is that if racial groups differ in the disease prevalence of of sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis, then they probably also differ in intelligence and academic ability. When you think about kids, like they walk into the biology classroom and then we offer up, we're like, well, why do you look like mom and dad? Or why do you look like your sister? And then we give them this simple Mendelian explanation for variability in humans. So the kids are taking the ideas that we taught them and they're using their tool. They're hitting that hammer on everything they can, and they're making sense of other disparities that they see in the world with genes. And so the working hypothesis that we came up with was, well, maybe what's happening is a kid comes into this learning and they perceive a lot of variability among people of the same group. So they think like people of East Asian ancestry are very different from one another biologically speaking, or they come into the reading and they think East Asian people are all kind of the same, which is a stereotype that's prevalent in our society. Or maybe they come in somewhere in between those two models. But when they read that each group has its own special disease, it implies a kind of uniformity within the group. And so the kids move incrementally to the model on the right, a little bit more. On average, that effect occurs in our studies. And then we also hypothesized it could do with categorization. So perhaps kids think that people of different groups share a lot in common, but they're still different. Or perhaps they think of human groups as being like more or less categorically different. They're very different from each other. There's a lot of between-group variation. So a kid could come into the reading in between any of these 2 points, but they move incrementally more to the model on the right. And if you think that categories are inductively rich, if you think that you can carve nature at its joints and that people discretely vary in these ways, well then that suggests that everything you associate with the category is very real. So it can drive the kind of development of stereotyping through categorization, or by leading kids to believe that everyone within the group is the same. Well, that is stereotyping. This idea applies to everyone in that group, right? So that raises this hypothesis that when people are exposed to biological or genetic information about racial group difference, it changes how people perceive, or how students perceive, genetic variation within and between groups. And then that is what's driving, through social psychological mechanisms, changes in this belief that racial groups differ in intelligence because of genetics. Even though intelligence was never a part of any of those readings that I just talked about. Just about human genetic diseases. And they transfer to intelligence, a different domain. That means we might be able to intervene on this variable and run this process in reverse. So by teaching kids that this model of human difference is flawed, and that this is a better model for the population structure in humans, we might be able to reverse this whole process and reduce stereotyping and reduce genetic essentialism beliefs. And so the National Science Foundation really liked that hypothesis, and they gave us about $1.5 million to explore it. And the big question here is, how can genetics curriculum and instruction be designed to prevent and/or reduce racism? That's what we are investigating. There's 3 phases to our research. We developed some curriculum, we implemented it in schools, we ran randomized trials to study its impacts. Then we learned stuff, we revised the curriculum materials in response to what we learned. And then we did things like think-alouds, where we had kids read through our materials and then they say their thoughts out loud, and then we content analyze their thoughts to make sense of what kinds of ideas are being elicited as the kids learn from our materials. And then we revise our materials to make them better. We've conducted quasi-experiments with them. We've done focus groups with these materials. We've analyzed an expert teacher implementing these materials in classrooms. So we study these materials in many different ways. We try to learn from those studies, and it's an R&D process to develop and revise an intervention to prevent racism by teaching genetics. Now we are at the stage where we've pre-registered a hypothesis with the National Science Foundation, and we are conducting a large cluster randomized trial. In actuality, now we have 25 different states and about 40 teachers where we're implementing like a 2-week intervention in schools to study the impacts of it. So I'm going to share a little bit of data right now from the randomized trials and the think-alouds. And this is what I'm going to argue, that teaching kids about human genetic variation and multifactorial genetics, some complex genetics topics, could reduce belief in genetic essentialism. It could do that because it changes how kids perceive racial difference. And that process works better. It's amplified. We get bigger reductions in prejudice among kids who already have some expertise or knowledge about human genetic variation in multifactorial genetics. So it works better for people who already know a little bit more. I'm going to unpack that. So the first question we had to ask ourselves is, what do we teach? How do we teach it? Who do we teach it to? And then how do we assess the impact? Those are the initial questions of the study. And we want to change this way of viewing race to have kids think about racial difference like this. So the first thing we taught kids is that scientists have never agreed about whether race is biologically real. That's a contested argument in the social sciences and the biological sciences, and it's still contested today. But race and racism are definitely socially real. There is racism in our society. The next thing we taught the kids is that the 0.1% of human DNA that differs between people is like the important kind of DNA that people argue about when it comes to genetics and race. And we wanted the kids to develop some population thinking, like that's a foundational understanding of the modern evolutionary synthesis. And that's the notion that populations differ from one another, and people within populations differ from one another. So we wanted kids to understand that, if you divide people up racially, using the racial categories used in the United States, other cultures do it differently. If you look at the US racial categories that we use today, not the ones in the past, the ones today, what you find is that the majority of differences in the variable part of the human genome are found when you compare the genomes of individuals of the same group. And that you get a little bit of extra difference when you compare the genomes of people from different groups. So we thought by developing that population thinking understanding, we could reduce prejudice because it would undermine the idea that racial groups are discrete or that people within a race are highly uniform. And then we taught people that these ideas about genetic variation, these patterns, can sometimes be distorted or cherry-picked by people who are making white supremacist arguments. They will emphasize certain things, de-emphasize other things. So we embedded it in a cultural and social context for students while they were learning about human genetics. And that's really important too. And our materials involve a lot of argumentation. The kids argue with each other a lot. They analyze data. They construct models of human genetic variation. And we do all that to promote conceptual change of students. We also design our materials to prevent backfire. You could do this kind of work and do it poorly and produce more prejudice, not less prejudice. So that's a big ethical constraint you have to work through. And there are psychological frameworks for dealing with those problems. So we use that kind of instructional materials as well. And so the way our interventions work is like we have characters who disagree about within and between group variation. They look at imaginary data, so they imagine what data would have to look like to support these kind of opposing views about human difference. And then that helps kids to make sense of real, actual data from the human genome that they can use to evaluate the ideas of these characters. And then the kids argue about what they think the real data means. And then we do that over and over again. And we do all kinds of other things as well. And then there's a little bit of lecture where we build up a lot of anticipation. The kids want to know, well, how does this argument resolve? Like, which character's right? Are they both wrong, or are they both kind of right? Like, what's the answer here? And that allows the teacher to kind of give a little bit of a lecture. And then the students apply their knowledge to kind of critique an essentialist claim made by another person. So you can imagine a kid going through this kind of learning. They walk out into the hallway to their locker and they say, like, that stuff that we just learned, I don't buy it at all. Like, everyone knows racial groups are genetically different, and that's why black people are good athletes and super musical. Right? Those are common stereotypes in our society. There could be no domain transfer. Kids could walk right out of the classroom, still maintain those racial stereotypes, and there could be no change. So we give kids an opportunity to transfer their knowledge into social situations that are different than the biology classroom by having them critique claims like that. And then throughout that, the kids are developing and revising models of human genetic variation. So we ran 3 randomized trials with this kind of intervention. We had 166 8th and 9th graders. That was like a 5-day intervention implemented by teachers in real schools. And then we condensed that intervention down to like a special sauce 45-minute computerized intervention, like psychologists would typically do. And then we implemented it in a study with adults, and then with 721 high schoolers from around the country, from Colorado, California, Washington, D.C., and Massachusetts. And then the control here is an intervention on climate variability. So the question is, like, why is that a reasonable control? Well, for one, race and genetic variation and learning about the human causes of climate change, super politically motivated ideological issues in American society. So if you don't control for ideologically motivated reasoning, you're going to get biased treatment effects. The other thing is, reasoning about climate variability, you have to reason about temperature and precipitation data and variability in that data within time zones, across time zones, within geographic areas, across geographic areas. So the cognitive difficulty of learning about patterns of human genetic variation is kind of the same. So that's our control, for better or worse. It's also inert. It shouldn't create any change in racial beliefs. We don't want to have a control that makes kids more racist, because if it did, then that would mean the treatment effect we're observing has nothing to do with our intervention. It could be because of the control condition. So then we measure the kids' belief in genetic essentialism using psychological scales. We also measure how kids perceive variability. So we give them items like this, where it's like, here's 100 people, say 100 white people, and there's a slider bar that moves to the left and the right, and these dots become more differently colored as you move the bar. And we tell the kids, when there's more differently colored dots, that means there's more variability within a group. Show us how much variability exists in this group. And then we have Venn diagrams where the kids they're labeled, say, white, black, and they can move them over each other, and we say, show us how biologically similar or different these two groups are. And we do that for all the census categories. And then we essentially divide the between group items by the between and the within group items, and that gives us a proportion of 0 to 100%, which tells us the relative amount of variability that kids attribute to race. It's kind of like an inner psychological estimate of like the FST, like the fixation index in humans, right? And then we also measure their genomics knowledge as well. So we measure their knowledge of complex models of inheritance, like multifactorial models that include polygenic factors and social environmental factors. Those items have some simple Mendelian questions, like monogenic trait questions. The genomics assessment also has just straight up like GWAS, polygenetic questions, and genetic risk. and it has questions about gene and environment additive effects on human traits. But there's no G by E, no gene by environment interaction questions, because that's beyond the grade band distinction for high school and the next generation science standards. And then we run experiments. So we measure the kids' genomics knowledge at baseline. That allows us to establish whether or not there's baseline equivalence between the groups. And then we assign kids to different conditions, and then we measure those outcomes. And what we predicted is that there would be conceptual change. Kids who learn from the race intervention should have lower belief in genetic essentialism. We think that change will occur because we change how kids perceive human genetic variation. And then we thought that it would be amplified, like we get bigger reductions in genetic essentialism among kids who already have some of this complex genetics knowledge. So that's the full hypothesis. And so what we found across all those 3 studies is that there was a significant reduction in the perception of genetic differences between races. So the kids are literally moving those Venn diagrams closer together. It was significant in all 3 studies. It was about a 3/4 of a standard deviation change. And we also got a significant reduction, close to a half standard deviation, in belief in genetic essentialism. And actually, we're getting a significant reduction where kids are going from agree to disagree. So that is actually happening. It's not just the kids agree less, or they disagree less. For those of you who are interested in the meta-analysis, this is the forest plot of the 3 randomized trials. And I'm not going to go into this in detail. I think the important thing here is that no matter whether we use a 45-minute period computerized intervention or a 5-period classroom intervention, we get the same kinds of size reductions in the perception of between-group difference in all of our randomized trials. But there is true between-study variance in the reductions in genetic essentialism. So some, like the classroom-based intervention that lasted for 5 45-minute periods, produced greater reductions in belief in genetic essentialism than the 45-minute computerized intervention, which on face value makes a lot of sense, right? Another thing that we found was this mediation hypothesis. So we found data that was consistent with our prediction that by changing the way people perceive genetic variation, we create a reduction in genetic essentialism. So what we found was that when kids learned from our materials, they moved these circles closer together, they made these dots more differently colored, so we're moving around perceptions of within and between group variation. But the effect on genetic essentialism is only transferred through changes in the Venn diagram. So it's like an othering process. Kids are perceiving less categorical differences between groups, and that is the process that we think is creating a reduction in belief in genetic essentialism. And it's between 1/5 and about half of the treatment effect can be attributed to that change in how kids perceive genetic variation. So what that basically means is our intervention is creating a change that's something like this. Kids go from thinking white and black are more or less categorically different to there is some difference, but there's less difference than I initially thought. And that's what's driving the reduction in belief in genetic essentialism. And the simple answer for why that happened is we designed our intervention to do this. So we use perceptual learning techniques to create this kind of change. So that might not be very interesting, because we kind of set up the experiment to produce the change using the mechanism that we hypothesized. But the big thing is like developing this model of human difference is something that infrequently happens in high school genetics education. And I would say it's something that needs to happen more frequently in our society. Because that perceptual learning could have profound impacts on how kids conceptualize and explain racial disparities in society. And if that's true, then it might also be important that we make genetics education more complex in general. Our curriculum tends to focus on monogenic inheritance at the high school level, and indeed, even if you ask college biology faculty, you will hear that that is emphasized very much in introductory genetics as well. There are good reasons for that. Not saying we should throw Mendel out, like we shouldn't throw the baby out of the bathwater. That's not what I'm saying. We just need to give a little bit more of a complex story. We can't finish with Mendel. Here's my argument for why. We also find that these intervention reductions that we get are greater for kids who have more complex understandings of genetics. So when we look at the treatment effect variability, down here we have a variable which essentially, if you score above 0, you have a greater than 50% chance of getting the kind of average difficulty question correct on our complex genetics assessment. So you have a greater likelihood of knowing things about multifactorial models of inheritance. And if you score lower than 0, you don't have as much of that knowledge. And then we have our two variables up here, perceptions and genetic essentialism. And here's the cutoff. So among kids who have more complex understandings of genetics, the treatment effect between the race intervention and the climate intervention gets bigger. We get bigger reductions among kids who have more complex understandings of genetics. And when we look at racial bias, we see the same effect. In fact, for kids who score lower than 0 on this assessment, there's no effect of our intervention. But for kids who have complex understandings of genetics before they begin this learning process, we get reductions in belief in genetic essentialism. So that's very significant because it's 18% of the variability in the data is accounted for by the kids' prior genomics knowledge, which intervention they learned from, in the interaction of the two. Now, talking to an audience of biologists, people will be like, so what? That's 18% of the variability in data. But in social science, that's pretty significant to explain that much variability in the data. And then we also had kids read through these materials and then talk out loud. So we also have a mechanism suggesting why this effect occurred in the experiment. So what we found is that there were larger reductions in the perception of between group variation, larger reduction in genetic essentialism among kids with a lot of complex knowledge of genetics. And we would predict that because when students have more of the relevant prior knowledge, that means they can construct more meaning from the learning materials. That means they can capitalize on the learning materials better. That means greater conceptual change. And there's like models of learning that explain this. So like if you have a learning experience that implicates your identity, and race certainly does, then you have kind of like one or two outcomes. Either you'll systematically process those materials, or you'll heuristically process them. So heuristic processing is like, I already believe this, or there's no way I'm believing that. You don't really make sense of anything you read. Systematic processing is like the peer review process. It's like, this paper bothers me. I don't like what's being written here. I'm going to read this and cut it up. We do that in peer review. That's systematic processing. Or I definitely agree with this paper. I'm going to go through and read carefully and explain to the editor why I think this paper is great. So if you have systematic processing, you can have real belief change or no change. It's kind of a rational process. If you have heuristic processing, you're only ever going to get superficial change or no change whatsoever. And the thing that sends you down one trajectory or another is basically your prior knowledge and motivation. If you have a lot of motivation and you have a lot of prior knowledge, you're more likely to systematically process learning materials. And there are plenty of studies showing that kids around the world actually are most interested in learning about human genetics. So kids arguably have motivation. The question is prior knowledge, and our data suggests that prior knowledge does facilitate greater conceptual change. And then when we look at how kids reason with the materials, we see the same kind of thing. So essentially, when we look at the data, we see that kids with more genomics knowledge, they're more likely to actively read our learning materials. So they're more likely to make arguments about the materials, more likely to apply their prior knowledge to the materials, more likely to question the materials, actively read it. They're also 39% more likely to talk about between group variability, and they're 23% more likely to talk about racial groups being genetically alike. So they are actually in the process of learning, doing more learning, and they are constructing more of the relevant understandings that would cause a change in belief. So all of that resembles this model, that when kids learn about human genetic variation, it interacts with their prior knowledge of genomics, and that changes how they perceive genetic variation, which can reduce this one form of cognitive prejudice called genetic essentialism. That happens because of perceptual learning. It's amplified by expertise in genomics, and it's replicable in high socioeconomic status schools that are majority white but racially diverse. So, still unknown is like, well, is it really expertise? Like, is this intelligence, or is this socioeconomic advantage, or is this like differences in academic achievement across schools? We don't totally know that yet. If we were to remove the perceptual learning techniques from our interventions, would we still get the same kinds of changes? We don't know that. We don't know if kids have given up a genetic essentialist way of viewing the world and replaced it with a different way, like a social constructionist view of race. We don't know if these effects transfer to other social contexts, like when kids walk out of the biology classroom. We don't know how long-lasting they are. We know they persist for at least 3 weeks. We've documented that. We also don't know how social discourse in the classroom produces this kind of change. We don't know how these effects vary by students of different racial backgrounds or genders. We don't know how the norms of the classroom, like anti-racist norms in the classroom, might facilitate or enable these findings. We don't really know what the teacher's doing to really create a lot of change either. Then there's a whole bunch of things about the samples. These are predominantly white samples. They're from high SES schools, from mostly politically liberal areas that have relatively low racial diversity. All of these sampling characteristics, for a variety of social psychological reasons, could be boundary conditions on these effects. So we don't know much about the external validity, although we're working on that now. But what I want to leave you with are these two implications. I think genetics education needs to do a better job. Now, I'm not saying this doesn't happen, but writ large, helping kids develop what I'm calling standard genomics literacy. So kids need to develop the understanding that human trait variation is explained well by multifactorial models of inheritance, and that only a limited amount of biological phenomena are explained very well by monogenic inheritance. That doesn't mean throwing the baby out of the bathwater. It just means contextualizing monogenic inheritance a little bit better. And then kids also need to have the opportunity to really conceptualize variability and develop population thinking. And then, if you want to go a step forward, I think one more thing to do is to help kids develop conditionalized knowledge, where kids learn how these biological concepts refute essentialist thinking. And that makes it more humane. By teaching kids how multifactorial models of inheritance and how patterns of genetic variation conflict with white supremacist arguments, that's what I'm calling humane genomics literacy. And I think in addition to that, there's a role for the science educator to teach a little bit of social science about how genetic ideas have been used throughout history to rationalize prejudice. That needs to happen because this content is not socially neutral. And that means helping kids to identify and use the conceptual tools of anti-racist scientific culture, which include argumentation, analyzing and interpreting data, and thinking counterfactually, and developing and using models to actually help kids develop some understandings of the nature of science as they learn science. And if you'd like to learn more about this story, we have a paper that we recently published. You can find that online. It's open access. We're extending this line of research into undergraduate genetics education with the new NSF grant that we just got. We've also done work on how biology education affects gender essentialism. We have a paper on that if you'd like to learn more. Thank you very much.
We have a little bit of time for questions, so anybody have a question?
In the back, yeah.
I argue that the term genetic essentialism in terms of prejudicial, the opposite direction as what you're trying to counter.
Can you elaborate on that for me?
Well, your argument is that the things that we see are variable, are due to complex things like multifactorial inheritance, environment, and so on. But there's a whole bunch of things for which there isn't much genetic variability, isn't much phenotypic variability. Right? So there are certain traits
rather than what I hear the end.
Rather than giving it a label, calling it genetic.
Yeah, so let me clarify. I don't want to equate Mendelian inheritance with essentialist thinking. If I did that, then that's not what I meant to do. And I'm also not arguing that Mendelian inheritance should go untaught. There are certainly forms of Mendelian inheritance that capture a lot of biological variability. I think the question that I'm raising is whether or not the biology curriculum spends too much time on Mendelian inheritance and not enough time on more complex forms of inheritance. That both should be taught. The story of genetics should not begin and end with Mendel alone, as it often does in high school classrooms. And my argument is not that Mendelian genetics is essentialist. I certainly don't think that. It's just that it has the unintended consequence of activating and ingraining essentialist thinking. I'm not sure if that clarifies.
I just don't like the term. I don't like the use of the term. I'm not arguing about what you're trying to do or what your conclusions are. I just don't like the term.
Okay.
Because it's just as, it's an oversimplification. In the same way that talking about Mendelian is an oversimplification.
Perhaps we should talk more afterwards and I can better understand where you're coming from. Not quite getting the distinction right now.
I'm expressing discomfort. I don't know if I can.
Yeah. It's an uncomfortable talk. Yes?
Let me just introduce my question by giving you a little bit of my background. I'm a social cultural anthropologist, but I also know quite a bit about statistics. And I was sort of struck with the talk about how much you emphasize differences between variation within groups as opposed to variation between groups, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to emphasize. But you only in passing mentioned problems with the definition of groups. And you didn't
Yes.
mention the words social construction. But these groups are defined differently in different places and different times. And I'm just wondering, is this sort of just too much outside of the realm of biology to bring into your
No, I agree with you, and I think what you're pointing out is a consequence of having not so much time to do the talk and condensing complexity. So in our curriculum materials, there was just an article actually in the New York Times called "Can Biology Class Reduce Racism?" that describes our intervention work. And essentially what we do is we refute essentialist thinking through studying patterns of genetic variation and multifactorial genetics. And then we help the kids to understand kind of structural and institutional forms of racism and cultural relativism about human categories. And then we kind of leave the kids there, essentially, with like an understanding of how race is socially constructed. So, and that's, I can describe that more to you if you want to talk afterwards about how we do that. I think it's a very important point. Yeah.
So, I really get the problem with the complexity of genetics and multivariate statistics and so on at younger ages. But have you thought much about, in terms of sort of learning theory, whether or not this kind of intervention needs to be sort of brought to bear even earlier? Is high school and undergraduate education in some ways kind of late? What do we know in terms of sort of learning theory about when these ideas begin to crystallize, in the minds of young people?
There are certainly maturation effects. There have been many studies carried out by developmental and social psychologists. So by kids reach what's called racial constancy, like they have categories by around age 3 to 4. And they reach race saliency, which is the notion that these categories have meaningful relationships to my society at around right before adolescence, like late childhood into adolescence. And after reaching race saliency, kids start to basically develop meaning and stories about the categories during adolescence. So if there was a critical age in the U.S. context, these vary from cultural context to another. If there was a critical period during the U.S. context, it's middle and high school. And actually, there's Susan Gelman at University of Michigan just published a paper, her lab, and some people at Stanford showing that Actually, at middle school, you get this significant bump among kids in terms of genetic explanations for novel human traits. And in 7th grade, in many classrooms around the country, is where kids first learn Mendelian genetics. So I think there's an argument to be made that it should happen during adolescence. The question of like, what does a learning progression look like? How do we scaffold instruction? What kinds of ideas need to be introduced at different grade levels to build a coherent storyline for kids is something that hasn't been answered by research yet, and we're putting together some grant proposals to do that.
I'm sorry to call a halt to the questions, but we have to move on to the next speaker, which is